Let's try that again. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Glad to be with you guys today. My name is Drew Gardner with the two Mississippi Museums. We want to welcome you to this week's History is Lunch. We're in our home, the Craig H. Neilsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and the Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. We're also streaming live on Facebook and YouTube, where you can watch any of our previous History is Lunch videos at any time. Please take this time to silence your cell phones. And I want to encourage you to join us next week. Next week will be a little different. We will not be having History is Lunch next week, but next week is a special anniversary. July 2nd, Wednesday, July 2nd, is the 100th anniversary of Medgar Evers' birth, and there will be some special programming happening here and throughout the museums that day. And so we encourage you to come back. We'll have some special flash tours about Medgar Evers at 10:30 and at 2 o'clock that day. There'll also be some other programming that'll be happening, and you'll see more of that as we get closer to that date, but it'll be open and available to the public. But we hope you'll join us back here at History's Lunch in 2 weeks, where we'll have, on July 9th, Suzanne Stern's presentation on the Mississippi River and the founding of the nation. But today, we are excited to welcome Andrew Kahrl. Kahrl is a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Virginia, where he specializes in history of race and inequality, in housing, real estate, and local tax policy and administration in the United States, as well as the social and environmental history of beaches, outdoor recreation, land use, and the development of coastal America. He is the author of several books: The Black Tax, 150 Years of Theft, Exploitation, and Dispossession in America; Free the Beaches, The Story of Ned Cole and the Battle for America's Most Exclusive Shoreline; and The Land Was Ours, How Black Beaches Became White Wealth in the Coastal South. Kahrl has also served as the principal investigator of a study of the history of African American outdoor recreation for the National Park Service. He teaches courses on race and real estate in the United States, local politics in America, urban history, and modern United States history, among others. So please help me welcome Mr. Andrew Kahrl.
Thank you all for coming out this afternoon. This is a real privilege and honor to be here amongst friends and many folks who have shaped this project in many ways. I could not have written this book, The Black Tax, without the time I spent at the archive next door, and it's really amazing to be back here to share some of this work with you. And I also want to particularly thank Drew Gardner as well for helping to make this possible, and for all the arrangements. Everything is just make sure I'm staying a little on time here. So I want to talk today about my book, The Black Tax, which offers a sweeping history of local tax systems in America from Reconstruction to the present, as seen from the perspective and through the experiences of African Americans. It really looks in particular at the history of segregation and the struggle for civil rights through a fiscal lens, and moves the matters of local taxes and public spending from the margins to the center of that history, and aims to change how we understand this history as a whole. Now, one thing I should mention here is that this is focused on local taxes, not on the IRS, not on the taxes you pay every April 15th. But local taxes constitute over 1/3 of all public spending in the U.S. And these taxes fund critical public services like public education, fire and public safety, water and sewer systems, streets and sidewalks, parks and playgrounds, you name it. And the bulk of those local tax dollars are derived from a tax on local property, all of which is administered by local officials. So these revenue sources are hugely consequential in shaping the lived experiences of all Americans. And so many of the issues and subjects that have consumed the attention of historians over the years, from housing and schools to public health, environmental injustice, and economic inequality. And yet, the actual process of raising and spending these public dollars has often been conspicuously absent from those histories. So my book really aims to tell how these local tax systems were built and maintained, whose interests they served, why they mattered, and how they came to shape so many of the more familiar struggles over race, rights, and power over the last century and a half. And it really also aims to demystify these policies and procedures, make them sort of discernible and easy to understand, because so often they were shrouded in mystery and complexity. And also in many ways were seen perhaps by the broader audiences as somewhat dry and boring. So I really try to sort of bring this history to life. And I do so by focusing in particular on the kind of the three main features of local tax systems, breaking them down into their core parts, in particular tax administration, the process of how tax assessments and tax rates are determined, and who makes these decisions. And then secondly, the matter of public spending, how local tax dollars are spent, what they're spent on, and who gets what, and the struggle over those resources. And then third, the matter of tax enforcement. And this is perhaps one, again, that sort of requires a little bit of explaining to do, which is basically the question of how local governments enforce tax payments, in particular property taxes, and what they do when people fail to pay their property taxes on time. And specifically through what are known as tax sales. These vary by state, but in broad terms, what happens is when unpaid tax debts come past due, they are auctioned off at local tax sales, and they're auctioned off to private investors who in turn can charge interest and fees on those debts, and if the property owner fails to pay within a predetermined period of time, that investor can claim ownership over their property, all for the price of a single tax bill. Now, in all three of these areas, Black Americans have historically been subject to insidious forms of bureaucratic racism and enduring structural disadvantages that have forced them to pay relatively more in local taxes than white Americans while getting far less in return, and have exposed the homes and land that they owned to predation and dispossession. And as I show in my book, the total costs of this are staggering, and have contributed in no small measure to so many of the struggles Black Americans have faced in the past, and so many of the inequalities that persist to this day. So my book really aims to sort of tally these costs, not through charts and graphs, the stuff that you might expect to find in a book on taxes, but rather through the stories of people and places, which I'm going to turn to this afternoon. And as well, it tells a national story of these local struggles, and one that spans across not only the past 150 years, but also looks at this at the national level, but devotes particular attention to Mississippi. And I spend a lot of time in the book at various points bringing this broader history here to the local level and focusing on particular communities, counties, and cities and towns across this state. And I intentionally situate Mississippi history within the broader currents of American history, something that far too few historians have done before. Often you see this tendency, especially in sort of the popular imagination, as treating Mississippi and its history as exceptional. And I really sort of aim throughout the book to show how much the issues and challenges that were shaping this state's history were tied to broader ones that were national in scope. So let me begin really where this story itself begins, in the period during Reconstruction. Reconstruction governments that were forming in the wake of the Civil War had bold plans for remaking the South, establishing universal public education, public institutions and welfare services that previously did not exist. And to fund these plans, states dramatically increased tax assessments on large plantations that had previously paid very little in public money to governments that previously had collected very little and spent very little themselves. And this, in turn, tax policies and practices in Mississippi, in particular during Reconstruction, not only increased the tax burdens on the state's wealthiest landowners, but also in some counties led to the breakup of many of these plantations, opening up, forcing land onto the market and opening up opportunities for small black and white farmers to acquire land. And this, tax policies that I show early in the book were really instrumental, and the politics of taxes were really instrumental in galvanizing opposition to Reconstruction and in the efforts to overturn these state governments. This fear of state governments that taxed the rich and invested in goods and services for the poor were an animating force in campaigns to overturn Reconstruction governments. Across the South, so-called taxpayer leagues formed that were often led by elites, but aimed to appeal to the common man and sort of galvanize broad-based opposition to Reconstruction policies. And these had a really demonstrable effect on not only leading opposition, but in some instances actually sort of the instances of violence and terror that overturned these governments. To give one example, Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1874, where a local taxpayer league marched to the courthouse on tax day and demanded that all black office holders resign, including the sheriff who was responsible for collecting taxes. After a standoff that lasted for over a week, this mob of taxpayers opened fire on the black militia, killing between 75 and 300 people and hastening the overturning of Reconstruction governance in Mississippi. And after Reconstruction, you saw these these so-called white redeemer governments slash public spending dramatically, especially on public education and social services, and at the same time, local tax assessors now firmly, these offices now firmly back in the control of white supremacists, began drastically reducing the tax obligations on the region's richest and wealthiest landowners, dramatically lowering their tax assessments, and at the same time, overvaluing the small plots of land that black people had managed to acquire. During these years in the late 19th century, African Americans worked diligently to build up a land base across the South. By 1910, African Americans owned upwards of 16 million acres of land, the highest amount that it would ever be in U.S. history. This is a remarkable story of achievement in the face of innumerable obstacles. And owning land, especially especially for that first generation out of slavery, was synonymous with freedom itself. It became understood as the means to become free. But these discriminatory tax assessments consistently undermined those efforts, making it harder to acquire land, harder to hold on to it once it was acquired, and also draining the incomes of those families who had managed to become property owners. And as I show in the book, these practices, while they were happening at the local level across the South, were virtually systematic. I did, focusing on Virginia in particular, I did sort of a thorough study of white and black assessed rates on land across the state in the early 1900s, and I could not find a single county in Virginia in the early 1900s that was not overvaluing black-owned land relative to white-owned land at the time. Here in Mississippi, studies found that in some counties, African-American-owned property was assessed upwards of 330% higher than white-owned property relative to value. Now, one of the things I show in the book is and argue is that these are the bitter fruits of disfranchisement. This is what happens when you do not have a voice in government. You have local public officials like tax assessors and tax collectors who were entirely unaccountable to black citizens and could overtax them with impunity while taking those tax dollars and spending them almost exclusively on goods and services for whites only. As we all know, for all the taxes African Americans were paying under Jim Crow, they received little to nothing in return. Their schools were grossly underfunded, their neighborhoods were neglected, White-controlled state and local governments, during this era, flagrantly stole black school tax dollars. There is a moving exhibit next door here in the Civil Rights Museum that shows in raw numbers the gross disparities in school funding in school districts across the state during these years. I should add, these figures are even more galling when you remember that those white schools were being subsidized by black taxpayers. By 1910, one study found that African Americans in the South paid roughly $9 million more in school taxes each year than they received in return. In Mississippi, the annual net transfers of black tax dollars to white schools was over $1 million each year. And when cities and towns during these years were embarking on infrastructure improvements and expanding the range of services that local governments were providing to citizens, grading roads, paving streets, laying water and sewer lines, these projects often stopped right at the edge of the black side of town. As one observer said of the typical southern town of this era, quote, "No signs are needed to identify the black and white residential areas. The black area began where the paved roads turned to dirt. The storm pipes become open ditches." Or if towns did provide these services to black citizens, it was of an inferior quality. Some towns used cheaper, narrower water mains in black residential areas, which severely reduced water pressure, which meant that if a fire broke out in a home in that neighborhood, it was rarely contained. And throughout this era, whites justified the paltry spending on black schools and neighborhoods by claiming that black people paid little in taxes and therefore should be content with whatever crumbs dropped from the white taxpayers' plates. This insidious myth, this lie, has really provided the ideological basis for this Jim Crow fiscal order. It justified these policies of neglect and theft. And it shaped so much of the politics of taxation in America as a whole, and continues to do so to this day. So many of these myths, I think, are really kind of percolate in so many ways, both large and small, in how we think about the ways in which taxes are raised and public dollars are spent. And then as well, when it came to tax payments, when black Americans failed to pay their taxes on time, and even sometimes when they did pay their taxes, local tax officials were often quick to seize and sell their property, especially when that property was valuable. I document numerous cases in the book of African Americans having their land legally stolen from them through tax sales. In one case, I tell the story of an entire black town in the Arkansas Delta that was lost due to a fictitious tax sale. As he was investigating civil rights cases throughout the South in the late 1930s, Thurgood Marshall heard numerous stories of people losing or nearly losing their land because a tax bill mysteriously failed to arrive or a payment was never recorded. And invariably, Marshall found that this happened to black people who owned property that had become valuable. And I tell the case here in Mississippi of Isaac Simmons, who owned a 220-acre farm in Amet County. And after rumors of his land having oil deposits under it, the county conspired to declare it tax delinquent, even though Simmons had receipts proving that he was current on his taxes. They hastily sold it at a tax sale. And when Simmons fought back and hired a lawyer to contest the sale, the white buyer of his land and co-conspirators abducted and beat Simmons' son, and then eventually found and tortured and killed Isaac Simmons. And they were acquitted by a jury for that crime. And they got to keep the land. And my book, it catalogs these injustices and tries to make sense of them and how these sort of fit within a larger system of power. But also, importantly, my book shows how black people fought back, how they resisted exploitation, how they guarded against these predatory schemes. and how they fought for an equitable distribution of public goods and services, how they fought for their fair share of the public's money, and fought to be recognized as taxpayers. You know, when you look at African American history through a fiscal lens, you know, it quickly becomes apparent that so many of the issues that drew people into the civil rights movement, so many of the demands that organizers and activists made, you know, so many of the battles that were being fought at the local level concerned matters of taxation and public spending. You know, one story that I think really captures this dynamic fittingly is the story of James Farmer, who was one of the lead organizers of the 1963 March on Washington. But James Farmer was not in Washington that late August day. He was unable to attend the march because he was sitting in a jail cell in Plaquemine, Louisiana, having been arrested days earlier while protesting the town's refusal to extend sewer lines into black neighborhoods. You know, when you really actually kind of burrow down and, you know, go community by community and look at what the issues and demands that were being made by communities, you begin to see these real questions about the sort of local power, local taxes, and public spending were at the sort of heart of these demands, that were how people experienced injustice on a day-to-day basis. You know, this neglect by local officials, you know, galvanized so many to join the movement. And I really, you know, tell this part of this larger history through the story of the town of Edwards, Mississippi, located here in the western part of Hinds County. And there, black residents, beginning in 1966, staged a year-long boycott of local white-owned businesses that aimed ultimately to force town officials to provide them with the same basic services that were being provided to white residents, like sewer lines, sidewalks, paved streets, garbage service, you know, tending to the black cemetery, and access to the town's swimming pool, all of which their tax dollars helped to pay for, and none of which they enjoyed. You know, this again, you know, kind of, you know, was, you know, sort of looking at kind of what were the sort of, you know, moments in which communities became galvanized. You know, this is an example of this. You know, just going through this list and looking at what were those demands, and also then as well, you know, looking at how, you know, those in power retaliated against local activists through the use of local taxing powers. In the case of Edwards, town officials punished black residents for this successful boycott, which lasted for nearly a year and crippled local white-owned businesses that were heavily dependent upon black spending in a town in which African Americans constituted 70% of the town's population. In retaliation, town officials went through the land tax assessment rolls and systematically raised, often doubled, the tax assessments on every African American owned home in town, except for those few African Americans who did not honor the boycott. They just went through the tax ledgers and just adjusted the tax bill of every black resident who, and we can see here, you know, these are images were taken as part of the federal lawsuit, you know, seeking to prove just how egregious these unfair tax practices were. The fact that these two homes, the one on the left white-owned, the one on the right African American-owned, received the exact same tax bill in 1967. They were literally valued as being of equal value. No more sort of, you know, damning evidence could be found. And you know, and here's some of the records as well. You know, all of which are you know, next door at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, which through the Tougaloo collections, which were absolutely essential in my work on this project. And one thing I should note is that, you know, while, you know, the case of Edwards was pretty egregious, it was far from the only example of this kind of use of punitive taxation as a way to intimidate movement activists during these years. In Sunflower County, for instance, local officials cut off water service and removed the tax exemption from Fannie Lou Hamer's church in Ruleville. In Little Rock, Arkansas, activist Daisy Bates had the tax assessment on her home jacked up following the desegregation of Central High in 1957. Several southern states during these years several state legislatures debated whether to just declare any church that hosted civil rights meetings to be ineligible for tax exemptions as religious institutions. So this was, again, sort of, those who were seeking to defend the Jim Crow order were well aware of the power that taxes had in those efforts. And one thing that's important to note is that none of these victims could find justice through the courts. In 1937, U.S. Congress explicitly barred federal lawsuits that challenged local tax practices with the Tax Injunction Act. They said that these cases could only be contested in state court. This effectively closed the federal courthouse doors to victims of unfair taxation by state and local officials. And the Supreme Court affirmed this when it declined to hear the case of the residents of Edwards, Mississippi, in a case filed by the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law on behalf of Edwards' black residents. So keep in mind that all of the major civil rights legislative achievements of the 1960s aimed in part to curtail local abuses of power, to put checks on the ability of local officials to be able to operate with impunity. The right to equal education, the right to public accommodations, the right to vote, the right to fair housing, all required an expansion of federal power and authority to ensure that those rights could be actually realized. And local tax practices were entirely exempt from federal civil rights protections, and they remain so to this day. Now, during these same years, another small town in Mississippi became the center of the legal fight for equality in public services. In 1967, lawyers for the NAACP Legal Defense Fund filed a lawsuit on behalf of Andrew and Mary Lou Hawkins against the town of Shaw, which for years had used its general tax revenues to pave streets, put in street lights, build and improve parks and playgrounds for its white population, while spending next to nothing on the black side of town. These actually were not just indignities, but had real life and death consequences. In 1 year alone, 7 homes on the black side of Shaw burned to the ground, resulting in 1 death, all because the narrow 1-inch water mains that the town laid on that side of town made it impossible to battle fires once they broke out. The landmark ruling in Hawkins v. Shaw established the principle of equality in public services that were derived from general tax revenues. It was a monumental case, a landmark ruling, and one for which the Hawkins family paid dearly. As the case unfolded and in the years that followed, the Hawkins' home was firebombed several times. Mary Lou Hawkins was murdered in cold blood by a local police officer. The final firebombing of their home claimed the lives of Hawkins' son and 2 of his grandchildren. All these cases remain unsolved. But white-controlled local governments, in spite of that ruling, in spite of that legal precedent, resisted the spirit of that decision. And I point to the town of Tunica, Mississippi, as an example of the persistence of shocking inequalities in local service distribution. There in downtown Tunica sat a row of dilapidated homes that faced a fetid stream known as Sugar Ditch. These homes lacked running water or flush toilets well into the 1980s. Their children suffered from liver tumors, abscesses, and parasitic and bacterial infections. And throughout these years, in the face of this public health crisis, the town consistently would take federal dollars for local infrastructure and spend it on beautifying the downtown commercial district, building a new runway at the local airport, spending it on everything except for the vital needs of the town's poorest and African American citizens. In 1985, this became a national scandal, one that attracted international attention. It was the subject of a feature story on 60 Minutes. You can still find it on YouTube. And in which these conditions here in 1985 America were being sort of broadcast to the world, and led in this instance to efforts to hastily address these problems, but in many ways sort of kept that the local sort of imbalances of power firmly intact. So this again is sort of that first sort of one thread of this larger history I tell. The other is the story of African Americans' struggle for political power at the local level, political power over offices like tax assessors. Following the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, local organizers and movement activists moved to register Black voters and raise awareness of the powers of these local offices, offices like tax collector and assessor. And majority Black counties, particularly one like Claiborne County in the state's Southwest, they offered some of the earliest opportunities to win elected office. And at the time, 25 of Mississippi's 82 counties were majority Black. And in 1970, a young school teacher from Port Gibson ran for and was elected assessor for Claiborne County. He was the first African American to hold that office in the state's history. And he ran a campaign pledging to bring fairness to the assessment process, to bring and to use the revenues that were being, to begin to actually generate the revenues that this county desperately needed to provide services for its community. And I tell the story of like what happened once he got into office, once he actually was able to see the records firsthand and discover the extent of this problem and the history of injustice that residents had faced. Seeing firsthand how antebellum era mansions and large estates were paying in dollars less than 2- and 3-bedroom houses in Black neighborhoods. Not in percentage, in dollars, literally less. But seeing this injustice firsthand, seeing just how unfair taxes had been administered for generations was one thing. Doing something about it was another matter. And as I talk about in the book, Doss in particular faced significant obstacles that were being put in his way in his efforts to bring about fairness to the residents of Claiborne County. County supervisors actively sabotaged and undermined his office's work. They hired people to spy on his office. They slashed his budget down to the bone, and eventually had him arrested on trumped-up charges, all aimed at discrediting him and demoralizing his supporters. But as I showed you, Doss remained undaunted throughout this, and at one point after, said, "I'm the victim of two things here." After being arrested, being Black and doing my job. I think that really sort of captured really sort of what he and many others would later face. And also as well, I think it's worth noting that the reforms that Doss ultimately sort of pushed for at the state level, reforms that aim to bring a measure of accuracy and accountability to these local offices, benefited countless numbers of white homeowners and landowners across the state as well. These were, again, the struggles that Black Americans were leading were ones that grew out of their particular experiences, but the reforms and changes that they were pursuing were ones that aimed to sort of bring about greater fairness and equality for everyone. Now here in Claiborne County in particular, it was one thing to ensure that everyone was being taxed fairly. The other problem that many counties faced was having a tax base was insufficient to be able to provide the services that local communities needed. In Claiborne County, that problem seemed to have been solved when the Grand Gulf nuclear power plant went online in the late 1970s. This located in Claiborne County meant that all the tax revenues from this power plant would be enjoyed by the residents of the county and where it was located. By state law, again, all property tax revenues went to the county that assessed its value. And as a result, overnight, Claiborne County's tax base went from 20 million to 350 million. Black residents began envisioning having the resources they need to provide quality public education, to rebuild their neighborhoods, to provide the social services that their communities needed. But in response, the state legislature went and amended Mississippi's state constitution and ordered that tax revenues from that plant, and only that plant, would be distributed amongst all counties receiving its services. A change that ultimately was upheld by the U.S. Justice Department and ultimately removed that source of revenue from this majority black county and its black leaders. Again, a decision that had profound effects on the very ability not just to tax fairly, but to spend in a way that addressed those needs. During these years also, when African Americans were fighting for their fair share of public goods and services, they were also fighting to hold on to their land. Between 1950 and 1970, African Americans annually lost 340,000 acres of land in the South. In Mississippi alone, over 13,000 black families were rendered landless during those 2 decades. Much of it was being gobbled up by large-scale agribusinesses or by land speculators and developers. And tax sales were one of the chief mechanisms of dispossession. In Mississippi, 1,600 black-owned family farms and homes were lost at tax sales each year. The rising rates of tax delinquency during these years were due to many factors. The fact that the prices that farmers could command for their crops were falling. The cost of running small-scale operations rose. The fact that many families had joined the exodus to the north in previous years, and there were challenges and disputes amongst family over tax payments that resulted in bills being unpaid. And these all sort of made African Americans more vulnerable to tax delinquency, and then once they fell into tax delinquency, made them particularly vulnerable to losing their land at tax sales. And this was a story again that was happening across the South, happening across the U.S., and still happening to this day. But I focus in particular on the concerted efforts here in Mississippi, in particular, to counteract these forces, to begin to protect the land 1 acre at a time. And in the face of this crisis, we saw organizations that were forming to protect and defend endangered black landowners. None more significant than the Emergency Land Fund, which had a statewide chapter here in Mississippi and was operating throughout the 1970s. And the Emergency Land Fund, here in Mississippi, identified under its leader, the executive director Jesse Morris, identified these tax sales as a real crisis, one that was flying under the radar, but was quietly resulting in this erosion of African Americans' land base across the state. And they spread out across counties, throughout Mississippi, poring over local tax records. Looking at legal notices in local newspapers, tracking down tax delinquent landowners and helping them settle their debts, running workshops across the state and tutorials where they explained to communities how these laws worked, what their rights were, and what ultimately their obligations were. And Jesse Morris was very creative in trying to establish programs that would combat the abuses of the tax sale laws. And he placed these eyes and ears on the ground in every county, who would report back to the state office on not just sort of particular landowners, but broader trends that were happening within land markets. He sent out staffers to bid at these tax sales. In some cases, the first African Americans to ever walk into these rooms where these tax sales took place. And he kind of, sort of had a keen sense of sort of what African American organizations such as the Emergency Land Fund needed to do. As he put it to me in an interview I did with him, in 2014, he said, quote, "We had to realize who we were dealing with. We were dealing with cunning people, so we have to be cunning too. They're not going away, and the only way to combat them is to try to stay ahead of them." This was, part of the sort of strategy and really the sort of, emergency that was being faced during these years. And I'll just conclude by saying that, none of these problems that I detail in this book can really be seen as something that's in the past. Property in Black and low-income neighborhoods is still overtaxed. By the latest estimate, 12% by upwards of 12% nationwide. Those same neighborhoods still tend to receive fewer and often inferior public goods and services. And low-income and minority homeowners and landowners remain disproportionately vulnerable to tax delinquency and to losing their land at tax sales. And one thing I should note, again, is looking at this local history at the national level, or telling a national history of these local problems, is that these are problems that state and local governments alone cannot solve, because in many respects, it's the entire fiscal structure that we see in the U.S. And the dependence of local governments on their own revenue sources and the broad discretionary powers that they enjoy over how they obtain it that is fueling these practices and continuing to result in the types of injustices that I know everyone here in this room is all too familiar with. The water crisis that unfolded here in Jackson in 22. The Jackson water crisis, as I argue at the end of the book, was the product of the same fiscal structures that have disadvantaged African Americans and the poor for generations. One that places local governments in charge of providing these vital public services like clean water, yet forces them to largely rely on their own sources of revenue to do so, while also at the same time allowing and indeed incentivizing wealthier communities and businesses to break off from poorer cities, form their own local governments, and take their tax dollars with them. These are structural problems that demand structural solutions. And so one thing my book really aims to do, and my work as a whole really aims to show how these structures were built, who they were built for, so that we can really see more clearly the work that they do. And ultimately, maybe give us some insight into what to do about it. So I really thank you for your attention, and I'm really eager to hear questions and maybe answer questions you might have. So thank you so much.
Wow, thank you so much. Are you prepared to be out of town by sundown? Okay. Would you say that the reason so much of this is still going on is because 85% of the Congress in Mississippi and in Washington are descendants of the slave masters, and they have vowed that they will make life as difficult for the in people as it is to dip the Atlantic Ocean dry with the spoon because we won the Civil War?
Well, what I can say is that my book really, and what my research aims to show is how these systems were built with certain intentions in mind. That the kind of the ways in which this tax structure that again sort of let's just take public education for one example. The fact that you have a system of funding public schools in America that is entirely sort of placed at the local level and allows for communities to be able to exit from school districts, form their own. All of this incentivizes those who are wealthier, who have advantages, to hive together into wealthy communities, to form their own local governments or school districts, and to lock in those advantages. And so, and at the same time, to be indifferent to the deprivations of those outside of those borders. And I think, one way we see consistently is we have a sort of a tax structure in the U.S. that really kind of gives those who already have historically enjoyed advantages the tools they need to lock in those advantages, and makes it incredibly difficult for those seeking to, say, have a broader distribution of public school funding, to reinvest in underinvested schools, have limited options for doing so. And so I think the question is why is it that this structure has been so resistant to change? And I think you have one interpretation of why that might be the case, and I think I really leave it to readers to say, to kind of go deeper into sort of what might be driving this, while at the same time presenting ultimately the facts as they are.
Andrew, we've got a question from our live stream on YouTube, and it asks just what started your interest in this topic?
Yeah, I mean, it was really from my time over next door at the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, and in many other archives that I traveled to, and came across these instances and it grew in particular out of the previous work I've done on the history of Black land ownership in the coastal South. Instances where African American landowners or developers were facing discrimination at the hands of local tax assessors, seeing their land being, dramatically increased in value for little to no reason, facing the threat of losing their land at a tax sale. That really led me to sort of, first question, one, how pervasive was this practice? And then the second question I asked is, why hadn't I ever heard of this before? I mean, I'd spent years studying the history of the civil rights movement, the history of segregation. I'd sort of, years of graduate education. Read long lists of books on the history of the civil rights movement, and had never come across any discussion of the fight for fair taxes and the challenges that local tax assessors posed. The story, to give one example, the story of the Edwards freedom movement, had been really left out of the histories of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, which I found to be utterly shocking, given how significant that case was, the bravery and heroism of the community that kept up that boycott for a year, and then the federal lawsuit that challenged these practices. This was, again, I thought that there was an important story that needed to be told. And also, at the same time, I felt that it was important for us as historians to really take on these subjects like, say, taxes that seem to be less sexy, less exciting, and actually show why they matter. And I think, from my vantage point as being someone who was not trained as a tax expert, I mean, I really had to sort of educate myself and really relied on others' expertise as I sort of worked on this history. But one thing I was really committed to was explaining this to an audience through my writing in plain English, in ways that you don't have to be a tax expert to understand, because in some ways that having things be written in an opaque language that is hard to understand, that was part of the sort of problem that communities faced. That was the way in which this power was exercised. Receiving some letter in the mail that you don't really understand what it says or what the consequences are, or some of the devious ways in which these injustices transpired. And so I thought, as a historian, it was important as well to counteract that through actually sort of explaining this in a way that you didn't have to be an expert to understand.
Thank you. Very informative presentation. Thank you. I was just wondering if within the topic of Black economic exploitation, mainly in taxation, could if we remember talking about immediately after Reconstruction, the 1890 Mississippi Constitution, which introduced the poll taxes, which it didn't only cause disfranchisement of lots of blacks, but also forced them to pay poll taxes, even though a couple of dollars, but at that time for black people coming out of slavery was a lot of money, and that taxes forced blacks to be not only disfranchised, but pay what they couldn't afford. And so that, I think, is an important aspect of taxation, which forced blacks to become more and more exploited. And secondly, black migration during the second decade of 20th century, 1910 to 1920, if you want, that during the time when blacks were migrating, the great numbers leaving the South, leaving Mississippi, going north, Detroit and those places, they left, a lot of them owned land, which they left behind, and they were not, the relatives were not able to benefit from. So I think those are also important situations that could be included in the same,
Absolutely.
The same topic.
Yeah, thank you for those comments, and I think absolutely it's worth mentioning here. Yeah, the poll tax obviously was another instance of using taxing powers to achieve broader objectives. In this case, as a mechanism for disfranchisement. That was one of the few taxes that whites in power actively did not want African Americans to pay, and that was the whole point of it. And the way it was designed was ultimately to allow those debts to accumulate to the point where persons who might want to even sort of jump through the other hurdles to register to vote would be legally unable to. But you're absolutely right as well, and mentioning how the exodus of millions of African Americans from the South during the Great Migration era, the dispersal of families, the fact that large percentages of African American owned land, and especially in the rural South, was held as shares in common amongst families of what's known as heirs property. All of this these just increase the number of risk factors that would make it more likely for a tax bill to go unpaid, or in some instances not even be received by the person who owed it. And these were, again, the sort of things that organizations like the Emergency Land Fund really zeroed in on. In fact, they did a lot of their work. They were putting radio ads that were being broadcast on black radio stations in Chicago during the 1970s, saying to listeners, does your family own land in the South? Contact us, we can help you. Because again, like realizing that each family who, with each passing year, the number of acres of land being lost at tax sales as a result of families who lived up north but still owned land in the South was increasing. So this, again, I think you're absolutely right. This was another significant factor in fueling those losses.
Thank you for mentioning Jesse Morris, who's also the co-founder of Liberty House. But I'm interested too, if you were able to peel apart the reappropriation of both public and private land. For instance, like Natchez Trace and spaces like that were that took up formerly black land versus private. Were you able to do that?
I didn't, but I think that is, that is a hugely important topic that I think is deserving of a study in its own right. I think there is much work to be done looking especially at the formation of national parks across the U.S. and looking at the process in which land was acquired by public agencies. I think this, if anything, one of the things I was hoping this book would do by really offering for the first time a kind of a history of taxation that kind of centers African Americans' experiences, and one that as well kind of moves the fiscal policies to the center of American history. Is I hope that it would inspire future scholars to delve into other related topics and to maybe sort of provide some of the research tools and approaches that would help them in doing so. And I think that is a good example of one of those areas of future work that would be really important to pursue.
Hey, Andrew, could you kind of talk about, my understanding is that you got a chance to interview Evan Doss, and you mentioned Jesse Morris. Could you kind of talk about your experience interviewing them?
Yeah, thank you for asking that. I think that is one of the most rewarding aspects of of research for me, and what really was foundational to my training as a historian was doing oral history interviews, including some here in this room. And I think that was the wisdom and insights and knowledge that I gained from doing those interviews early on in the process was just absolutely crucial to forming the questions that I was asking, the kind of leads I was pursuing. Issues that I had been entirely unaware of, or problems and challenges that were just completely off my radar, came about through just sitting down with folks. And Jesse Morris was, so for those of you who knew, he was, as I later learned, was a very fairly reclusive and one who was difficult to get to sit down for an interview. And I was just particularly honored that he decided to give me his time. We had a really rich and rewarding conversation. And similarly with other veterans of the civil rights movement. I did interviews down in Edwards, Mississippi, at the local public library with many of the community elders, and I thought those moments were reminding me of why I do this kind of work. And Evan Doss, in particular, he remains a figure in Claiborne County, one who. Had a long, whose career is worthy of a study in its own right, but also someone who, I was, really excited to get a chance to sit down and talk with and go through all of the, both kind of what sort of led this young school teacher to decide to run for tax assessor. And as I learned, and I talk about in the book, it was because he was wondering, why doesn't our school have any money to provide textbooks to the school children? Like in this land of rich, large plantations, why are our tax revenues so minuscule? Asking those questions ultimately led him on his own political career, and I think these are things that I would not have known had I not had a chance to actually meet and converse with him.
I am very pleased that you noted the Claiborne County situation over the Grand Gulf.
Which you, I must say, were the person who taught me about that. I had no idea about that until we spoke. So
that when that occurred, there was serious discussion amongst a number of people in Claiborne County and beyond on how to use the money that could be garnered from Evan Doss being able to assess them and get them taxed at a reasonable rate. People talked about changes to the healthcare system, to the public education system, and many people saying, is there some way we can get to take that money and just give it to the population?
Yeah, there was talk of like a universal basic income.
And that was the point at which the state leaders decided to take away the taxing ability of Claiborne County on the Grand Gulf.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think again, we see this pattern play out of when communities had the resources, when that you saw these efforts to utilize tax reforms and structural changes to undermine those efforts. And Claiborne County was a particular example because of just the vast expansion of the tax base resulting from that nuclear power plant. And an entirely unprecedented decision, one that went against past precedents in the state, had really no plausible explanation other than the fact that this was a majority black county that was enjoying this large tax base.
Hello, good day. I first of all want to offer you the highest of accolades for standing before people and talking about this, and because everything cannot always be a good talk or a good lesson when people hearing bad news or different news. But my history, my family's history is of the Delta and doctorate in Mississippi. So I'm born and raised in Florida. But as Dr. Taylor now in the universities and studying, Mississippi is my heritage home, but Jackson is new to me. So, but you spoke of counties that the Simmons and the McGees and all these people, they're relatives or somewhere in my family. And my question to you is, from the historian part and the land losses and the lands that are out there, how do people reach you to speak to you or come to you for aid, or do you do that? And trying to help guide them on how to
Yeah.
their history and their lands.
Yes, and I think that is happens quite often, and it, I should sort of begin by saying I'm not a lawyer. So I cannot offer legal advice. But in states across the South, there are organizations in particular that help families with land issues. The Appleseed Foundation. I'm not sure if they operate in Mississippi. I know they have a center in Alabama. In South Carolina, the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. So I try in those instances, and I do get phone calls to my office, emails out of the blue from strangers who just had come across an article that I'd written or my book, and seeking help. And I respond as rapidly as I can to those messages, because I think those are incredibly important, and ones in which families are reaching out because they are facing a crisis that is that they need not just sort of legal assistance, but just kind of someone to help explain what's going on. And I can at least do that. But I think one thing, and I think that's sort of what I see as my obligation in those instances, is to point them to those who can assist them and to provide at least a direction to go from there. So, but it is it always. Those moments always remind me of the sort of stakes involved in both, and also what the power of telling history can provide, and making families or individuals realize that what they're experiencing, they're not experiencing alone. And this is, that these are problems that, again, have been and currently are being addressed, and that, to seek out that kind of assistance where it's available. So, thank you.
Real quick, thank you again for your presentation. Kind of similar, but I just want to ask this question. Should or could your research be used towards the argument of reparations for Black Americans?
I mean, certainly that's something that those who have read my work see that this is one that is another piece of evidence pointing to the need for reparations. Early in the book, I sort of, just as a sort of back of the envelope estimate, say, if we're looking here at the total sort of material losses, we're talking here, in the hundreds of billions of dollars. And so that is one thing that I try to focus on in my work, and I think it should be always at the front of any agenda for structural change or reparations, is structural changes to these current laws and systems as they currently exist. Because these are continuing to drain communities of wealth. They are continuing to make property more vulnerable to loss. They are continuing to result in these maldistributions of public dollars and resources. And with, that needs to happen perhaps before or certainly alongside any efforts toward reparations, because without those structural changes, you can expect to see any sort of wealth transfers immediately be siphoned off back into the hands of those who had preyed and exploited vulnerable populations in the past. So I try to really sort of keep the focus in particular on, or at least say never lose sight of, the urgency of these structural problems. The fact that tax sales continue to take place, and that the tax buying industry, and it's an industry that makes billions of dollars each year, buying these debts and making money off of poor and vulnerable families. This industry needs to be sort of understood. These laws need to be ones that should be the focus of movements for reparations, alongside of addressing the legacies of the past.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, we've reached the top of another hour. I know we have a number of questions still in the audience. One of the best ways that you can come and ask Andrew about that question is to come up here and grab a copy of one of his books, The Black Tax, as well as his other book, The Land Was Ours. But let's give Andrew another round of applause.
Thank you.
I hope that you will join us again, not next week, but in 2 weeks for Suzanne Stearns. We thank you guys so much for being here. Again, come grab a copy of Andrew's book or come ask him a question. Thank you guys so much. Y'all have a great rest of the day.